All right, welcome out to Three Martini Solutions special episode where we're going to talk about Under the Banner of Heaven. Casey and I are going to do this, a duo, dynamic duo. Under the Banner of Heaven is a new TV show or a limited series, I think they call it, on Hulu. I think it's going to be 7 episodes. Last week they just released the first 2 episodes, and I think I know the reason why they did that. Maybe, uh, but
Why?
you know, well, I think because the first one sucked. Uh,
Okay.
maybe sucked is the wrong way. It was, we'll get into it, but I think it was very dense because it's setting up a lot of stuff and maybe a little boring. But so, the thing is it talks about these murders that happened in Utah in the 80s. And it happened, something happened in Utah. It had to do with Mormonism and had some close ties to fringe Mormon groups and made some noise back then nationally, I think, but definitely within the Mormon community. Both Casey and I grew up Mormon. And I remember a little bit of this, and so I know. So I was very interested in seeing this dramatization of the story, not ever really diving really deep into that story previously. So it's based on a book. The book came out in the early 2000s. I never read the book. I don't know if you did, Casey. Maybe I think you said you did. No?
I've read
Uh,
some things of it. Well, it's also sitting on my Kindle right now, but
so is my understanding about the book, and we kind of see this in the TV show, that it goes through these murders that happen of a
yep.
woman and her child, and but it draws but also goes into early Mormonism and some of the what later became a fundamental offshoot of Mormonism of you know and without reading the book, I don't want to say too much what I think because I'll probably be wrong, but it's my understanding that it draws some ties to what these people did, um, to some of the teachings of the early church and some of the things that are still taught or still believed to some degree, possibly within the fundamentalist version of the LDS Church.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
the Krakauer did base a lot of his book off of interviews with Dan Lafferty, which is one of the, spoiler alert, one of the brothers that did the killing, who was, arrested and now sits in prison. Um, he so because of that perspective, I think you're getting a window or a perspective from Dan Lafferty's view, which is obviously skewed. There's a number of fundamentalist Mormon groups in Utah and other places. They all like to cite back to an originalist view based on early church teachings and stuff. But I think a lot of it, you can also trace it back historically to just when the church started prosecuting or excommunicating people who are practicing polygamy. That when that happened in like the 30s, I think this is sort of a reaction to that. That Mormonism had started in the early 1800s, and then progressed through, and then polygamy officially ended in 1898, unofficially ended 20 years later, and then a little bit after that, there were still people practicing it, and so then they started to like punish it, and so then people who were really wedded to that decided to keep it, right? So depending on how you want to draw those lines through history, it can be, again, like with any, religious movement, like they're complicated, but
Yeah, and um, thanks for that.
Well,
I didn't
I
have the
was,
dates written down.
well,
So,
I curious about things, so I just started doing research and looking up stuff, and I'm like, oh, because I mean, I was in Utah.
yeah,
I lived there.
you,
I wasn't very old at that time, but
right. You grew up in Utah, and so I think you're going to have a much different perspective on some of the things that happened than I did growing up outside of Utah. Um, Still within Mormonism, but I think there's a different brand of Mormonism within Utah than outside of Utah. Not 100% different, but more intense maybe. And we'll probably talk more about that. And when I was thinking about even just setting up and talking about this stuff in these episodes, it occurred to me that like I'm like, oh, well, maybe we can talk about the two episodes that came out and then maybe talk about the criticism separate from that, because there has been a
sure.
lot of criticism of these first two episodes from people within the Mormon community. And but as the more I thought about it, I think it's probably difficult, or if not impossible, at least for me, to separate talking about the TV show without addressing the criticism along the way. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we can
Yeah.
just chat about it and how it flows. That's fine. We can try to keep it separate, and then
Well, I don't think it's necessary, you know, uh, but these first two episodes come out, and kind of like what I said, I think that first episode is very dense, right? Because it's setting
yeah,
up the storyline. And I think it's introducing somebody who's not in the church to a world which uh, is probably not well known by people even inside the church, but definitely a foreign thing to people outside the church, and was really trying to be an introduction to kind of the different things that you might run into as a member of the church, whatnot. Do you think that's fair?
yeah, cool. Because I think when you grow up in the Mormon Church, officially known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints, we can say at least once the long name. Um,
Okay.
I think when you grow up in the church like that, it's a big part of your life. It's a big part of your identity, and so I think what happens is you think your way is the right way and perhaps the only way, and then as you get older, you start to realize that other people might look at things, understand things, were taught different things, and so you start to see there's more variety within you know Mormonism than perhaps you thought, and so then that causes frictions. And I think that this, as I was watching the first episode, and I saw different viewpoints of Mormonism presented, there were parts of it. I mean, everything in it was familiar. I think
Hmm.
that you know, I think that Black and Dustin Lance Black, he also grew up Mormon, and he, I think he's trying to tell a story and communicate things about the Mormon faith in a way. And so there's different techniques that he's using that are. It's not like a documentary. Like
Right.
run of the mill Mormons are not going to like talk like that, act like that, and do that all the time. And
Right.
definitely everybody isn't going to act exactly like that. But there are different ways of doing things to show how much your faith permeates. Like, I'm not sure how many Salt Lake City cops have used like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir as an interrogation technique, uh, or how many like detectives have flashbacks to like early Mormon history. But at the same time, if you're a Mormon, you do think about those things, and you do
Right.
think about you think about what you're doing in relation to those ideas and stuff too, because you are going to be doing like that guy does. You're going to be talking to the people in your congregation, and it mixes in a strange way. I mean, when Salt Lake now is what 60, maybe 50% Mormon or something. I don't know what the latest figure is, but like in the 80s, it was higher than that. So I mean, most people that you saw and associated with were going to be you know of the same church as you, which
Or at least
it
familiar with it.
for sure. Oh well, everyone's going to be familiar with the church in Utah.
Yeah.
So I
So
mean,
I just want to give a brief overview of what the first episode was, and I watched him once. I maybe should have watched him twice, but the first episode sets out the basic story. We open up on Andrew Garfield's character, and and he's a detective. He gets called to a crime scene. He finds these murders. They quickly, um, the husband of the wife of the woman who was killed, um, basically says, "Hey, here I am." They take him into custody, and they start going through this investigation, right? And there's
Right.
flashbacks. There seems to be three different um, time frames going on. There's the current one with the investigation. Then there's flashbacks to this woman's early life, how she even comes to Utah, her roots in Idaho, meets this guy and gets introduced to his family, the Lafferty family. And then there's a third kind of time frame that we flash back to, which is early Mormonism, right? And so this first episode is just kind of setting out in my opinion, a framework for what we're going to see down the line. Oh, Casey, you just went away. Oh, there he is. You're back.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's a lot of exposition being thrown out there. And I think it is that first episode is an introduction to maybe a non-Mormon of what Mormonism, not maybe what Mormonism is really, but kind of some of the factors that are unique to Mormonism that play a role in this murder case that probably don't show up in other kinds of murder cases, right?
Right. Right. Because there's a
And
real aspect to it.
yeah, and so I think the director, you said his name. I'm not familiar with him really. Maybe I've seen some of his work in other things, but I just don't know who he is.
He directed Big Love.
Okay. So, okay, another Mormonism type thing. Okay, so that makes sense. Um, and uh, and so I think, is using some techniques to do so. So, I think the other day when we were talking before we did this, I said, "Is this a real character?" Andrew Garfield's character is a real character, and you said, "No, it's a composite," which makes sense because I think his character really is a proxy, maybe for how um, maybe a proxy for the like basic Mormonism. Like I think somebody said that he's in one of the critical reviews of it. I saw that he's a buttoned up church guy, right? And he's like the prototypical Mormon guy, maybe. Um,
Right.
but as you said earlier, you might know people that are like him, but they may not, even the typical Mormon guy, if there is such a thing, probably doesn't use that kind of language like in a professional environment. Doesn't do those sort of things all the time in a professional environment.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the criticisms was how often he says Heavenly Father. And Mormons refer to Heavenly Father as God, but because they do have this concept of Heavenly Father, I think they're having him say that more often, just
ri-
because that's how we talk about things. But yeah, anyway.
yeah, and I think he is that a character that says to the non-Mormons, this is, take a look at this. It's different than what you are. It's different than what you might regularly see, but it's not a lie, right? It's not a false character. You
Right.
do run into that sort of character within the Mormon church. You see people who are very similar to the Andrew Garfield character, but maybe just not to that degree. But I mean, they have an hour or whatever it is to show
Right.
it. They're trying to just throw it all in there to say, expect this. It's a different world. They use different language. They use different stuff, right? And the husband that they're interrogating, he he throws out tons of exposition, which I probably never happened. But as a storytelling, uh, I think that as a storytelling tool, he's necessary to, again, introduce people who aren't familiar with Mormonism or whatnot into some of the things that may be playing a role in what's happening here. So, and that's why, because of that's how they set up that first episode. I think that that's where a lot of the criticism comes in, because I hear a lot of the criticism that I read from Mormons and really non-Mormons alike was simply, I grew up in the 80s. That's not how Mormons talked when I was around. That's not how they prayed. That's not how they dressed. That's not whatever. And when I was reading through it, I'm like, okay, well, they weren't telling a story about your experience in the 80s as a Mormon. They were telling a story about what these people's experience was. And I don't think it's disingenuous to say, you know, there's all different types of Mormons. There's all different types of crazy. And this is a unique crazy. And it doesn't represent all Mormons, but they're not trying to tell a story about the typical Mormon. They're trying to tell a story about an extreme uh, group of people who happen to be affiliated with the Mormon Church and use some of those early teachings to
Right.
support their crazy. And so I when I read some of those criticisms, I'm like, oh man, you're just being real defensive here, right? You know, just
Reminds me of when Julie was on The Real World, right? You know, she's Mormon on The Real World, and so I think because whenever you're a part of a group that Mormonism is a minority religion in the United States, right? It does have a history of being persecuted. So many Mormons have a persecution complex to a certain extent, or they're easily like, we get defensive really quickly. We always want to present the best foot forward. I mean, also we proselyte like crazy. Both of us have done the door knocking thing. So, I mean, it's like, that's a big, so you have an interest, or you feel, or you're taught, like, if you're going to be the Mormon, you need to be a good example of the perfect Mormon sort of thing. And so I remember when Julie was on The Real World, like, oh my gosh, she's not representing, that they were like, oh, she's not a really good Mormon, or all that kind of thing. And they were sort of policing her thing. But I mean, she's just as much as Mormon as I am, or anybody else,
yeah.
Is it whether how closely she adheres to the tenets of her faith. Well, I mean, you can argue that about anyone, but I think it reminds me of that criticism here too, that people want Detective Pyrie to be that perfect example of devout Mormon father, which I would argue also doesn't really exist in the sense that Detective Pyrie as he is literally presented on the screen also doesn't really exist like that either. But nothing that he has said was unfamiliar to me, at least from all the different Mormon men that I have met in my life, myself included. So there's pieces of it that it all sort of, none of it was unfamiliar.
Yeah, I thought like it would be if they were trying to portray that, and maybe this is too nuanced a position, but I think if they were trying to portray that character as the typical Mormon, I would disagree with that. But I think that they were, again, it was a storytelling technique to introduce people who may not be familiar with that world, and it's, if you look at a spectrum of crazy Mormon people, that character is on that spectrum, right?
Yeah. Well,
He's
also
not so far out there that you can dismiss it.
yeah, and it also depends on what Black decides to do with his character, moving forward, right? Is
Right.
Pyrie going to be more of a central character? Is he going to go? I mean, I think he's laying some hints that he's going to have some sort of faith crisis of some sort. So it'll be interesting to see if that's heavy-handed or more authentic to the other thing is some of the way they talk about, one of the criticisms I thought did make sense, or that, well, it's in the trailer, so I guess I should not talk about that, but like some of the language they use comes from more modern Mormon history, like in the more like recent 10 years type things, some of the ways Mormons talk about things, but still again, I'm interested to see what happens after in the next 5 episodes that are coming up. I thought it was I think as a thriller, it's already started off pretty well. Like the second episode, I mean, I'm a jumpy person. I'm watching it alone, and I'm like, I definitely jumped a few times to some of the stuff that was happening. So it's well executed as far as what's going on.
Yeah, and the second episode I think was much better. It starts to fall into a better pattern, in my opinion, of of setting up the who done it. I guess, I mean, I don't think they're trying to hide who did it necessarily, but they're not coming out and saying it was this person. They're not it's a little bit different than the traditional thriller, but yeah, that second episode, things start moving along quite a bit, and you kind of get like, you know,
Right. The real question is, everybody knows who did it, and a quick Google search will tell you. But
right.
what you want to know, and what you're asking questions about still, is how do they exonerate Alan, who is, the Brenda is the
Mhm.
victim, and and he's her husband. So like, how do they exonerate him? How does he get to be off the hook when he first shows up covered in blood? Right. And they
Yeah.
start to address that in that second episode, where he says, well, he was sort of praying in her blood, and I think they're gonna explain that probably in episode 3. So Brigham Young lovers, blood atonement incoming. So you know,
Well, one of the criticism about I heard about these first two episodes, I read, is that uh, the book had a lot to do, focused a lot on polygamy, and in these first two episodes, they don't really talk about polygamy that much.
right? Because
And
then they'll be able to get into that, because Alan never practiced polygamy. It was Dan and the other guy's
Ron,
name, Ron. Dan and Ron. They were the ones who were excommunicated for polygamy. So
yeah, and so I think it's there's a lot yet to come.
yeah,
And just and I'll try to get back to, in case anybody listens to this and they don't have never watched it. So the first episode they go through, they kind of set up the framework. We find out that Brenda, uh, she marries this guy. She runs into the Lafferty family. Now the Lafferty family, I want to talk about how they portray the Lafferty family in these, because I have met people, not homicidal people, but tell me if I'm wrong, Garrett. Tell me if your experience is different than mine. I have met people who I'm like, oh yeah, they remind me of that kind of family. I think they hit the right tone with that sort of family. A very patriarchal family, one where they get together and spend a lot of time together. There's expectations within the family of what you're going to do for the family. There's not a big
yeah,
separation between you as an individual or you as an individual family unit and the rest of your family. And it's very structured, and the eldest father in there rules the roost, and everybody's subordinate to that. I don't think it's unique to Mormonism, but you do see it um, a lot in
sure.
Mormonism.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're the last names, right? The Laffertys.
Hmm.
The Laffertys are like this. The Laffertys get it done. Yeah, there's a there's a dynastic aspect to it, because there are definitely sort of dynastic families within Mormon history, and still currently, right? Especially in Utah, one of the with the emphasis on family history, right? So there's sort of that, passport that you can give of my family history. I mean, I can name all my ancestors back 4 generations. Like, you just learn how to do that, and you talk about this history, this lineage, and so
Hmm.
there's that concept of it. And there's all sorts of ways you can take that. One of them is like, oh, I love my family, and I want you know to be with my family type thing, and they're important to me. But then there's that, oh well, we're the Johnsons, and the Johnsons are like such and such, and we have this legacy that we need to preserve, our family reputation, legacy,
And it's your
dynasty.
obligation to
Yeah,
put the best face on for the family and to be a pillar of your community and to blah, blah, blah. Right.
yeah, right, right, right.
There's stuff that really doesn't, I think it exists less today than it did like 1950, but there's
Sure.
still
Or 1980.
people, yeah, or 1980. But you still see it within the Mormon church, I think.
Yeah,
Probably more so in Utah than outside of Utah, um, just because of the concentration of Mormons.
right.
It may be the same percentage of Mormons inside of Utah as outside, but there's just more Mormons there. And I think it was something that was taught to a certain degree within Mormonism. And I say the 1950s because I don't know, maybe it started earlier than that, but I think it used to be a bigger part of the teachings of the church where you need to um, be that sort of representative for your family. Or is that wrong? I mean, you could tell me I'm wrong.
Oh, I think I think so, but I'm not sure it started in the 50s. I think it's always been like that. I mean,
Okay.
you look at the debate over who was going to follow Joseph Smith in leading the church, and then like the schism that happened after that with, Emma and his sons wanted to be passed on, in that patriarchally, like from father to son. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but then Brigham taking it. But I mean, there's apostolic families, right? You're like, oh, I'm related to such and such apostle and their families. Like there's that, like the Smiths are definitely prominent in Mormon leadership for many generations. I mean, speaking of fundamentalist Mormons, one of the breaks for fundamentalist Mormons was when Joseph F. Smith started prosecuting polygamy in like the 30s or 40s. I forget exactly when it was. So it's like, that's part of it, but he was part of that dynasty, and how was he connected to, the original Smiths, right?
Right. So the family legacy is huge. Like it is not a religion that looks down upon nepotism in any way, shape, or form.
No, and especially not in family relationships, right? There's that this is what we do, and we have this thing, and
and there's a sense, and maybe this is going too far, but I kind of think there's some to it. There is a thought out there that to be a good leader is a product of breeding as much as it is a product of experience.
Yeah. Which I think you can trace to all sorts of different ideas, both good and bad, in Mormon and American history.
Right. And so I think that lives on to some degree within Mormonism, whether people want to admit it or not. You come from a good family, a good Mormon family with good pioneer heritage. There's a different expectation. You might be tapped for leadership roles over other people who don't have that same heritage in some areas. I think that's becoming less and less, but I've seen it.
Well, for sure. I'm sure you've seen it. I have too. Like, because I think it's really the question of, look, there are good ideas and bad ideas in all sorts of traditions. The rub though is, what do you do with those ideas? Like, and also, how do you deal with things that happen that are bad within your tradition? Because nobody's perfect. There's no group that's perfect ever. How do you deal with aspects of your history that are problematic or even bad? What do you do with it? Do you, like many families, we don't talk about that relative. We don't talk about that incident. We don't talk, we just pretend it never happened. And you see that happen with, we see that happen with church history type thing. And that's one of the things I think that's going to come out in future episodes and stuff too, is how much of Mormon history do people know about, and have they discussed and grappled with in different ways? Because one of the things they allude to in the first, they have flashbacks to the Mountain Meadows massacre, which what that has to do with the Laffertys, I'm not quite sure, but other than its connection with like maybe the Danites and blood atonement, sort of. But I mean, I think that's a tenuous connection. But how many Mormons even know about those things? For a long time, they sort of pretended it didn't happen. Now there's a monument, and they've sort of dealt with it more. But again, that happened in the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, when the church actually sort of talked about it more openly.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to mention this, because I thought there was a line in one of the episodes, I can't remember which one, where I think the Alan, the husband who's being interrogated, basically voices what was it, what was the guy's name, the producer director?
Oh, Dustin Lance Black.
Dustin Lance Black. I think he's voicing what his concept for this series is, which is, hey, if you don't know that violence is part of your church history, then maybe you're not a good Mormon. And he says brother or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that line. And I think that is like the underlying theme to a lot of this. That's why I think that's how he's trying to tie in these flashbacks to early Mormonism, saying, there's a history there where the church, more so than today, taught a had teachings that were more black and white, more violent, more um, inflexible to to certain things, and was really, you come at us, we're going to come back at you twofold, threefold, fourfold, right? And I think part of that, I think the Mountain Meadows Massacre portion of that just plays into it. This is what this religion is capable of doing if it's not, in the wrong hands, essentially. And I think that is a hard truth maybe for Mormons to digest and to accept and to process through. But I don't think it's illegitimate. Like I think it's a legitimate argument, or there's a legitimate position to take in this series. And not knowing, not reading the book, not going overly deep into it, uh, searching what happened and whatnot. I think, but just the basic Mormon kid growing up there, hearing certain things and knowing the things that have happened in the past, yeah, that that's part of early Mormonism, right? Less so now. I don't think it's fair to say that's what the church teaches now, but it was part of early Mormonism to some
Right.
degree.
Well, and Black is really asking people and Mormons specifically, how do you, what happens when, you grow up, I think of the children's song, right? Jesus said, love everyone, treat them kindly too. When your heart is filled with love, others will love you, right? You grow up singing that and you think, oh, that's what I'm taught as a Mormon growing up, right? Then what do you do when you learn about parts of Mormon history where Mormons fought back and were vindictive and even malicious, and then also murderers, and in the sense of the Mount Meadows Massacre? Like, how do you hold both of those things in your hands? And some people can, and some people can't. And so that's sort of what, how do you handle that? And there's different ways to do it, but it is part of history.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge for people, because some people just can't do that. They can't hold those things. They're like, if there's anything bad, I can't be it, so I can't do. Which, that's a legitimate answer, or legitimate just conclusion to draw. You can also say, look, it's run by humans and it's not perfect, doesn't justify it, but it doesn't mean that there isn't any good in it either.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I'm generally the kind of person that thinks, hey, you can't really blame an organization if you got a crazy person acting like a crazy person. And I think that these two guys who killed, I mean, I think we're going to find out more about it. I don't think they haven't fleshed out the motives and all that kind of stuff. That is yet to come within that.
There's a
Just from
revelation.
Yes, there is a revelation at some point. I remember that, from being a kid, that the murders happen, spoiler alert, because of a revelation, and this woman and her child needed to be killed. These are crazy people doing crazy things. I don't think you can necessarily say Mormonism caused them to be crazy. I think what you can say is that their crazy was fueled by something that they were familiar with, which was Mormonism and the early church. They could have been crazy in something else, right? And they come by that crazy, honestly, I think maybe because of the family that they were raised in. The
Well,
patriarch Ammon's not painted in a great picture in this thing, the dog murderer, psychopath.
yeah, well, right, but I think too, um, I also think it's, we often use crazy in different ways, but like, I don't think this is just a case of like mental illness. I think that they had seeds of that, but I don't want to give Dan and Ron sort of an easy out by saying, oh, they're suffering from mental illness and whatever. I think that I think in their respect, they had seeds of certain things, and they were bad people, and they nurtured that, and then they used the tools at their disposal, right? So if you're predisposed and to do things, and you're an abusive person and stuff, then you're going to use whatever tools or justifications you have at your disposal to do that. And they happened to grow up Mormon, so they're going to use those tools and see that from that lens. I think if you can never, you don't know for sure, but had they grown up in a different tradition, they would have used those too. Like it's always that, whenever we
Right.
try to figure out, well, I have a friend who says, like, if you think you can think like a murderer, there's only one way to think like a murderer, and that's to be a murderer. Like, you're never going to figure
Right.
out why they do it, because it doesn't make any sense. Like,
Yeah.
you can't explain violence in a way, because it's not logical. And
Right. You said it better than me. I agree with everything you said. But
well, that's what we talked about.
that's the sentiment that I was trying to get across, and yeah, you're right. Crazy is too easy of an out because it suggests mental illness, and I don't necessarily think that they were mentally ill. They're just bad guys.
Well, it does come into play because there was a capacity issue for Ron.
Oh,
So when
damn it.
Ron, yeah, no, that's what I get for reading a little bit of research before this. Because so what happened was, Ron, when they were arrested, Ron did try to die by suicide in prison, and he suffered brain damage as a result. And so after that, then there was questions about whether or not he should stand trial, and that was one of the issues on appeal about his
Well,
capacity.
I think that's a little bit different. I mean,
Sure, sure.
he was,
In the
yeah.
interest of full disclosure and
Hmm.
thoroughness,
Okay. Yeah.
but he did die in prison. But Dan is
Oh,
still,
okay.
yeah, Dan is still alive.
So the second episode, like I said, gets more into what led, the framework gets set in the first episode. They get a little bit further within the investigation, but then we start really seeing the seeds for how what kind of led up to the murders. So kind of like the slow evolution of the Lafferty brothers into a more, some of the
Insidious.
things that come into play, the prompted some of their shifts in their beliefs, maybe, and in their how they view the world, or and stuff like that.
Well, I have a question for
Issues.
you in that sense,
Okay.
because, like, how, because there's been some discussion about how Mormon women are depicted, and how Mormon women's story is being told in this series.
Okay.
So, I
Do
mean, what
tell.
do you think? What do you think about that?
I think that I have seen in my life Mormon women represented in each one of those. I don't think it's the full spectrum, but I've seen some of them that are very the wife of, I believe, Dan, right? She's very nervous. She's very almost like
Matilda.
on a mental breakdown,
Yeah.
trying her best, trying to fit in, never quite getting it right despite her best efforts. I've seen that. I've seen the Ron's wife, who seems to have everything all put together and the perfect hairdo, and seems to have it all. Um, the mother of Ammon, who's kind of like, we need to be the person that is behind the scenes, supporting our husbands, making sure they look good. Seen lots of that. Um, I don't think it's an unrealistic portrayal of Mormon women. It's not a full one by any stretch, because I think they're typically more complex than that. But you even see Andrew Garfield's wife in the way she's doing things. Yeah, I've seen those sorts of women within the church. What about you?
I have. I think from a storytelling perspective, one person said, "What an interesting show it would be if it were told from Brenda's perspective." Because right now,
Oh yeah.
it's definitely from Detective Pyrie's perspective, um, and which is, it's interesting that they're choosing this sort of patriarchal way of telling this very patriarchal and influence
Hmm.
story, but having it told from Brenda's perspective might be interesting.
And yeah,
But
I would agree with that. And there's several times in there, like, I love the scene where she kind of pushes back against her BYU professor who seems to be hitting on her. I don't know if that is a real story from her past, or if that was something that they created for the TV show, but I know women get put in that position. inside and outside the church. I think that is
Right.
a, and whether it's she really did that or you just want her to push back against that guy, I was rooting for her. I was like, yay.
I would say in some ways, Brenda, at least how she's depicted in the first two episodes, um, does represent a lot of Mormon women that I have interacted with,
Mhm.
in the sense that I went to BYU. Like they're seeking an education that's important to them. They want to be successful. They also want a family. They also want to be active in their faith, and they understand it. And because she talks about it, and she's very the way she talks about her faith and things. She's very faithful in that. But what's interesting is she does that, and then she's also going, "What are you doing to some of the weird, more the fringy Lafferty stuff?" I'm interested to see how they develop how she deals with all of that, because she's a resource to Matilda, and Matilda's like, please stay close to me. Like they all
Mhm.
are drawn to her because she's incredibly charismatic, but she seems to have found that elusive balance between faith and her, you know not
I
really that balance between faith and the rest of her life, and she's
Right.
comfortable with it,
That scene
which is why I think it drives Dan and Ron crazy, sort of.
that scene where Brenda does try to step in and help Matilda was very hard to watch because I think it was so real, to be
Yeah,
honest,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the way that the men, and this is not across the board, but I do definitely have known men within the church who would look at her and say the things that the men in that show looked at her and said the things about her in a negative way. And it's hard to watch because it is so true. Like that, I thought that was a very real portrayal of something that happens more often than it ever should. And the discussion, I can't remember which characters were, but somebody's talking to Alan and said, well, you know, why is she going to BYU if she wants to be a mother?
Yep.
That I have heard people say that. Like that is
I
not made up BS. That
uh,
happens.
Yep, I was at BYU in the '90s. I guess I should date myself now. And one of my friends, she was a math major and had a BYU professor be like, "Why are you here?" Or
Mhm.
there are, you know, you're taking the place of a man who could go to this school.
Right.
Also, um, I remember discussions between BYU male students saying, "Is your wife going to work?" And like as if and they weren't married or even dating someone. But that was a decision about because they needed to make that decision for their family type thing. And
Mhm.
which I remember those discussions and thinking, but
Yeah, it's hard to watch because you see that, and I think that maybe this is why there's the criticism and the defensiveness. I think that I'm I'm gonna overgeneralize here, but I think that most Mormon people, they look at that, and whether they want to admit it or not, they know that that happens, and it's not a good look. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't portray the church as something. But those are the things that happen so much more regularly within the church than a murder, right? The murder is the extreme part of it.
right,
But these
right,
other small slights against women, against men who allow their woman to do that kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff is so prevalent. I can see how people watch it and it's so uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me, and I don't think, you know, I don't have a problem with it, but it's still uncomfortable to watch because it's just such a bad thing, and it is
yeah,
it's horrible. And so
yeah,
you kind of have to suck it up and say, yeah, that's really part of this stuff thing. And it shouldn't be, but it is.
right. And I think that's the uncomfortable friction, because there are parts of Mormonism that are beautiful and that you love. And when you see the parts that you don't love, that are not as beautiful depicted, you're like, yes, that's familiar, but it's not what I want it to be. And so that's why it's uncomfortable, because you're like, I just want it to be better. because I know there are parts of it that could be better, and when it doesn't perform as advertised, you're like, oh, do you just want it to be better? I mean, you want it to be the Mormonism that Brenda sees, right? She sees the
Right.
beauty, because it's definitely parts of it she likes and wants to do, and she talks about feeling the spirit and listening and all of those things, and she finds, she sees the good in Matilda, she sees the good in Alan, and all the people around her. She was apparently she was very special and very unique in that way, and a really amazing dynamic person. But authoritarians find that very, very threatening.
Absolutely. She could do everything a man could do, if not better. And so the men in a very patriarchal family are going to be threatened by that.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about her dad, actually, because I think that her dad is more like a modern day Mormon than any other character, and he still does some cringy things. To be honest,
Sure.
like that one scene where they're driving from Utah, and she comes in second place, and she talks about going. He's like, well, you don't want to go to Chicago or New York, these big cities. He's kind of tamping down her dreams instead of supporting what her dreams could be. That's a little cringy, but at the same time, he loves his daughter. He wants his daughter to succeed. He wants her to be successful. He doesn't want to see her in a bad situation. He's going to push back against a strict patriarchy. He's going to stand up for his daughter. That's more of a modern Mormonism sort of dad of a girl that I see, or I have seen. And so I think he softens a bit. And maybe that character is there to be a juxtaposition between the patriarchal authoritarian thing. I think it obviously is, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that that's a fair representation of what you would see in modern Mormonism of a male dad of a girl, right?
Yeah. Well, then he wants, many Mormon parents want their children to stay close to the faith, but they still want them to achieve their dreams, and of course, like most people I know, your version of your dreams and your parents' version of your dreams are probably not quite exactly the same, and so there's friction. Right. That's part of growing up, and I think that was depicted pretty well through a Mormon lens. Even with the funny joke about going out with the strange groups in New York and Chicago, including Democrats, heaven forbid.
Yeah. I mean, they obviously have a slant to this, and it's and so I see why this criticism comes up, but then again, it's just like it's not so far off base that you can dismiss it and say this is not Mormonism.
Well, Mormonism was incredibly conservative in the 80s.
Still is, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed. Still is.
Still is, but it was really, that was it was only 10 years before that the church was actively fighting the Equal Rights Amendment. And, the Equal Rights Amendment just came up a few years ago, and the church issued a statement that they're still against it. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that long before the 80s that they finally gave black people the priesthood.
Right.
like the stuff that the church doesn't want people to remember didn't happen that long ago. It's still currently happening in a lot of circumstances.
Right. Organizations change slowly.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this. So the first episode kind of lays a framework. Second episode, we start getting into more of the storytelling. I love the Andrew Garfield's character, the Taba, or what was his name? I'm horrible with names.
Detective Pyrie?
No, yeah, but Andrew Garfield, Detective Pyrie's partner, or the other detective, the Native American.
I don't remember his name.
It starts with a T.
He's I don't remember his name, but he he's a Paiute. He's from a Paiute Indian. Is how he would say. that's what he says, and then he's Native American or indigenous is what we would say.
Yeah.
The characters in there calling him a Lamanite, which is a Book of Mormon reference, is
Which so that's one of those things. Like if it was shocking when I heard it, but I have heard that used fairly regularly. Not recently, but I would say 80s, 90s time frame, they referred to indigenous people or Native American people as Lamanites a lot.
well, they
So I
had
think,
that's when they had the Lamanite placement program.
yeah. So I think that's a very accurate depiction of language that they would have used in the 80s. And I feel like it's derogatory now. I don't know if it's viewed that way. Maybe it felt derogatory when I heard it in the show,
It's
but it's like, oh my God. And it was something that I hadn't even thought about in a while. But when I heard it, I'm like, oh yeah, they used to do that. Kind of cringy. But the second one, they go through this, more of the investigation part, and they get into some of the you know, he goes up into the mountains and starts. They haven't told us explicitly this yet, but they start running into these more fringe group Mormonisms. They have more. They start discovering more of what these brothers are into, which is fringe Mormonism, and there is a big difference. I think the LDS Church these days has tried to get away from the word Mormon because Mormonism maybe is too expansive. It does include all these offshoots of Mormonism, which do include these really fringe groups that have extreme views of different things. And so, but that is the world that these brothers grew up in. And and I think maybe some of the criticism seems to be based on like
well,
that's not
actually,
regular Mormonism, and they're trying to take these fringe groups and make it seem like that's regular Mormonism, and I don't think that's what they're doing. And but they're not very explicit about it either, saying these are fringe groups, these aren't mainstream, and so, but
but
they definitely are fringe.
still, the Laffertys aren't that fringe, because the Laffertys, the mother and the father, remember, they go on a senior mission for the mainstream LDS church. It's only after they leave on their mission that Ron and Dan create their own fringe group. So they break off late. So it's not like they're a member of a fundamentalist group that has been going for a long time. They start their own new one in the 80s. I mean, and there are some that are forming now today. Like I'm aware of some that are have started just recently.
Yes.
You can find them on, and now they have Facebook groups, right? But they're not necessarily living off the grid in the national forest, but they're I mean, I remember going to school competitions with and some of the people who would compete were from fundamentalist groups, Colorado City, and you always knew them because the girls would it was business competitions, and the girls would show up and they just dressed differently, and you could see they were always very nice and kind and stuff. And I think that's the other thing, like even within fundamentalist Mormons, I think there's a lot of them who are good people living what they consider their faith and stuff. It's like, but they never get the press. They're never going to get the get any of the attention. It's just ones who were authoritarian or aggressive and stuff, that's going to get all the press for sure too.
Yeah, and so one of the first criticisms online I saw of the first two episodes was the opening scene is of these little girls in these pioneer dresses, and they were saying, "Oh, they're trying to make it look like Mormons are basically fundamentalists or whatever." And I thought, in the show doesn't really explain these things as maybe clearly as Mormons would have liked. But I think that particular scene, if we go back to that particular scene, that opening scene, they show these little girls in these pioneer dresses, and the criticism is that's not the way we dress. That's not the way they're trying to make regular mainstream LDS Mormonism to be the same thing as like a fundamentalist group or some other fringe group of Mormonism. And the reality is that scene was set like the day before Pioneer Day, which is July 24th.
Right.
And it is very common. So like I grew up outside of Utah, but even outside of Utah, a lot of Mormon men and women would dress in pioneer clothes around July 24th to celebrate Pioneer Day. And for the brief time that I lived in Utah, guess what? Saw it all the time. Right. And so even
So,
though it,
did you ever
like,
go on?
I'll go ahead. Well,
Did you ever go on Trek?
no, that was after my time.
Yeah, me too. Okay.
But yeah, like it's still today, some Mormons will dress up in that sort of old timey clothing to do something called trek, where they pretend to be pioneers to relive the good old days. I guess I don't know, but
Oh, I've seen some. I saw some on social media where they gave them stuff and they like built a temple, like a mock temple in the middle of the desert or wherever they were doing this trek, which is, for the listeners who aren't Mormon, it's LARPing. It's live action role play for Mormons when you dress up like pioneer ancestors and go on some sort of journey with, and it's like youth pastor stuff, right? Sometimes you do things like that to teach a lesson and to connect. It's for youth usually to connect them with different things, and you tell stories, and there are effective versions of it and there are less effective versions of it. I never did it, but for some people it's a very meaningful experience. And
well, I think that scene plays an important role because it says to the viewer, even modern day Mormonism, or at least modern day as of the 80s, still has a close connection to early Mormonism, right? So we want to think, well, that was 150 years ago. We don't do that anymore. But there's so many things from that time period that we still hold on to tightly today.
Yeah.
And you can't just dismiss it as that was 150 years ago. And that goes back to, I think, the overriding theme, which is if you are a Mormon and you don't know about this particular history, maybe you're not a good Mormon. And maybe that's too ham-handed, I think, for me to agree with explicitly, but I think it is true in certain aspects that there is a history out there, and we like to hold on to the fun parts of it, the non-messy parts of it, but there are those people out there that are more than willing to go grab onto the messy parts of it and incorporate that into their own beliefs. And Mormonism is like the internet. Like whatever crazy idea you want, there's probably something there in church history that will support it.
Well, that goes for religion anyway. It's like, look at all the arguments that Christians have over interpretations of just, the New Testament. Like you can find something in there that'll support whatever you want.
Right. It's a crazy thing that's, I think, human, not necessarily just religion, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. We're coming up on like an hour-ish into this. I don't know how much more we want to talk about. I'd like to talk about future episodes as they come out. I'm because I don't know much about it, I am very interested in seeing the future episodes and what's happening. I'm going to watch all of them. I think, unless they get really bad for some reason. But what do you think about it just as a TV show?
So as a TV show, I enjoyed it as a true crime thriller. I thought it was, it's definitely pretty well executed. The acting is pretty good. So I've enjoyed that. I mean, it's definitely dark. That's what they're trying to go for, and that's where it's partly weird because I'm always sensitive to how religious folks are portrayed in movies and things because it's hard to get right. It's hard to depict people of faith in a way that's, and this is any person of faith in a way that is respectful of their beliefs and their practices. it's hard to portray in a way that doesn't that if you're an outsider, you're not going, they're just a little strange. But religion is pretty common across the globe. So it's how can you do that in an honest and respectful way? That's always interesting to me. But they're definitely taking a dark view of it. So I've liked it so far. I mean, I think the characterization of the different characters is interesting. I do like the storytelling thing of like, how are we going to get Alan out of here? Because that he's not he's arrested, but it's one of those things where they make a big deal in the very beginning saying it's always the husband, it's always the husband. Well, it's not the husband in this case, and so that's sort of an interesting twist to it. And I think that's a helpful storytelling thing. I think it would have been better if they had done it from Brenda's perspective, because that's a more interesting story. But
this I'll just have to admit, I didn't think of this story being told from her perspective, but after you mention it, like as I've been sitting here, I think that would have been a more interesting story. I would have loved. I think I would have liked that better. Yeah,
because she's a great character,
right?
And she's the victim. She is the victim literally, but I think she's the victim figuratively too. Like, here is this, person who is all of the good things that this particular belief system has to offer, that's found a path through, and then gets destroyed by some of the more insidious potentials in this belief system, which is, and that's a very human story, and I think that's very universal in that, like, there are bad people everywhere that are going to use all sorts of tools to do bad things, and so how do we protect the Brendas of the world type thing? How do we make it so that more Brendas survive and participate in society type thing? I mean, that's sort of a big question.
And maybe because the TV show is taking a more theatrical viewpoint to telling the story than the book did, but it's still based on the book, and of course she's not alive to tell her story. There's less material there to base it off of, so the producers of the TV show would have to make up more stuff, but they probably could have interviewed her family and her friends and everybody to get that kind of perspective.
May not have wanted to.
And they may not have wanted to.
If you were her family, would you want to do interviews 20 years later or 40 years later?
Oh my gosh. And that's the thing. Like, I thought, as much as when I was thinking about this and kind of how excited I was to watch it, or I am to watch it and stuff like that, there's been a couple of times I'm like, this was a real person. There's two real people that died, and in a horrific way, for nonsense. And it's a little sobering when you think about it like that. But I think that story, growing up in Mormonism, and seeing women who have both been Brendas, right, and have continued to be Brendas, but then seeing Brendas, that sort of person, who have been crushed by the religion and the patriarchy and stuff like that, is also not fun to watch and see.
Yep.
And I think probably anybody growing up there has seen that, and it's very sad when that happens.
We need to make sure and talk about that next time when we have a woman on the podcast.
Well, yeah. So hopefully Jessica can join us, because I think she'll bring a different perspective than
absolutely
than we would have. So I kind of hate to say this, but I would have a hard time recommending this to people. Like, I think if somebody were to tell me that they have, if somebody expressed an interest in Mormonism stuff, I don't know. I don't think it's a great representation of what Mormonism today. If you want a, right. I don't think of, so it would be a thing that I'd be like, I don't think it's bad. I think it's just like, even taking the Mormonism part about it, if I'm just watching it as interesting, I think the first episode was clunky, to be honest. Well, I didn't enjoy it as much. And even though it has everything that I should be interested in and am interested in, as far as different, Mormonism types of things go. I love, the whodunits. I love the, certain true crime things. Um, but I thought I think the acting was okay. What really threw me off is when Andrew Garfield's character did use all that Mormony language within a professional setting. I'm like, I don't think that happens. And it was actually um, you who said, no, I know people that probably would have done that. To say, okay, well, that then just wasn't my experience knowing those people or seeing those people act that way in a professional environment. But something that was so over the top to me, like I gotta think that, when he bust into that interrogation room after Alan says that he left the church, and Andrew Garfield's character's like, do you have a temple recommend? Are you living up to your covenants at temple? That was so cringy. I'm like,
Yeah.
if that has happened, it's happened like a handful of times. Like
Right.
people don't, it's in a criminal investigation, like they're not doing that. They're just not doing that.
That is true. However, Provo City Police were reporting to BYU as within the past 10 years, I think. I should probably check my details on that, but
They're reporting what?
honor code violations.
Oh, honor code violations. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I believe that.
Well, but that's a definite. I mean, that's just a different flavor of what you're talking about. Like,
It is. It is. That's fair. But some of that stuff in the TV show just kind of pulled me out of it. And, and maybe somebody who's not affiliated with the church in any way sees that. And if they think that, oh, this is what Mormons would do, somebody, that sort of criticism, um, I get. I would agree with that kind of criticism. That is not that's something kind of out of the ordinary. It's
very
little
few.
bit off the spectrum there that you can attribute that to you know somebody's normal experience. But I didn't like all the monologuing, even though I thought it was necessary. Like the police work, these were like, especially in the first episode, these were horrible police. Like, like there were so many times this guy's like alluding to things that are happening, and they're not asking the logical follow-up questions. Like, what do you mean? you know, there was Old Testament prophet looking people. Like, who are they? Do they have names? They're not asking any of these questions. So I'm like, the police work here sucks.
Well,
And
but
that kind of pulls you out of it.
that's true. But I'm not a police person, so like, how many interrogations are realistic on television? Because usually most interrogations, like most depositions, are incredibly boring. Um, the only
Well, I
ones you
don't
watch.
think it has to be a realistic, but I don't expect it to be a realistic portrayal because that would be extremely boring. But I think that we have watched enough police dramas, whatever, and seen interrogations in TV shows that we're like, no, like you
Like
aren't you going
that.
to ask?
I don't know if I agree with you anymore now that you say it like that, because I watched Making a Murderer, and that had like real interrogations. So
Okay.
maybe what we're seeing is those Wisconsin cops actually worked in Utah in the 80s. I don't know.
Well, I was just like, I mean, like days, like what is it? Like 24 hours go by and they haven't even let this guy tell his story about who he thinks the murderers are. And then at one point, I don't know, I think it was maybe in the second episode, he's like, you know, we see innocent people in here all the time, and they're jumping up and down giving us names, and you're not giving us anything. I'm like, wait, like you're not even asking the follow-up questions. Like, this guy obviously has a story to tell, and if he's saying he didn't do it, well, who did it? And it takes you 2 episodes to get to who did it.
Yeah, I
But
would like to see what if how much of the real interrogation of Alan Lafferty is actually used in this. But yeah,
but like, hey, these bad guys are getting away. Every minute counts. Like, there's probably people out there covered in blood, and we're,
did text them.
monologuing.
Um, because when were they first arrested?
Oh, how soon after the murders were they arrested?
Yeah. So she was actually murdered on July 24th. So
Okay.
it was Pioneer Day. Yeah, so they weren't arrested for a month.
Wow.
They were arrested on August 17th in Reno.
Well, I'm very interested to see what happens. I would say this, you know, like I said it before, I those sort of characters, like one of the things I did think that was really good about it, um, the the tone, the vibe you get from certain characters was spot on. Like the vibe you get from those brothers that is very uncomfortable, like on inside and outside the church. I've met people like that, and I'm just like, ooh,
Yeah,
nature is
yeah.
saying
I mean,
stay
you,
away.
you read the Tara Westover book, Educated, right? Um,
Tell me about that. I'm not familiar.
so Tara Westover, um, her her family, she's from Idaho, and she went to BYU. I don't know, maybe 90s, but she her parents didn't want her to get in. Her father especially did not want her to get an education, and she did, and
Oh, okay.
she. But yeah, it's a book, and her parents were more
I think
fundamentalist,
yeah. Now that you're
more
talking about it, I think I know.
but
Yeah.
they were definitely fundamentalist in how they interpreted, very traditional, I guess, or orthodox. I mean, I'm not sure how they would characterize themselves, but yeah, they're definitely closer to that. I mean, because you have the Ruby Ridge incident in Idaho, and that happened around this time, and that's why many Mormons are afraid of the federal government, because of how that happened. So there's, like you said, there's history, and it's not all ancient Mormon history. It's recent too that feeds all into this. So
Okay, so one last thing before we wrap up, and they portray different Mormonisms is like it particularly there's the scene if you remember when the Andrew Garfield's partner offers him French fries, and it's like a
uh,
big secret to eat French fries. Like so within Mormonisms, there's the word of wisdom, and um, for whatever reason, Mormons ignore all everything except for uh don't drink coffee, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke, and forget the other parts of it that are talk about eating healthy and doing all these other things. And it seems like like there were some people, there's some Mormons I knew that were very health conscious and were a little kooky about it, but that scene, I'm like, I wanted to ask you, like, was that a thing in Utah where they would it said something about you, like people were like, oh no, we don't eat fast food or anything like that? Because I think that that's opposite of what I see typically.
I had never seen anything like that. Like,
I wonder if that's this, Mr. Black's experience that he saw Mormons like that. I don't
he
know.
had fry sauce. Are you kidding me?
Right. Like I
So
thought I thought especially Utah people love their French fries. And I'm like, why does
sure.
he not eat French fries? I thought everyone he liked French fries.
Yeah, that was a miss.
So I
Yep.
can't recommend it because of the fry, the French fry screw up.
The fry scene killed it. Yeah, the
The
fry
fries
scene.
he killed it for me. I'm like, I'm out of this. Everybody
So
loves French fries.
so I will say, if people do we want to give people some resources to read?
Sure.
I will say, if people are looking for some interesting articles about fundamentalism and this history and stuff, there's Juvenile Instructor, um, which is for Latter-day Saint scholars, and there's some interesting episodes. I think if they just do a Google search for the Juvenile Instructor, under the banner of heaven, because there's a group of articles that are collected there by some scholars about Mormon fundamentalism, also the book, and there's some interesting stuff there. Haven't read all of them. I've read some of them, but the scholars there are really good, and they do give kind of a good, fair exploration of these things. So, um, I think that's a good resource for people if they want to look at it. I mean, you can also go to the Wikipedia and things too, but the juvenile instructor has a good collection of essays. So
Yeah.
you
Well,
can
I
put them
think, what's that?
you can put them in the notes or whatever you do.
Okay.
I'll
Well,
send
I
you the link.
think, yeah, I think that, you know, I think Mormonism is fascinating to a lot of people because I think people think of it as like a kooky sort of religion of beliefs. And I don't know if it maybe is because it's only been around for a couple hundred years. And so it hasn't had time to work out, hasn't had time to hide all of its crazy stuff. It's been too recent. There's still too much documentation out there. You know, 2000 years ago, if we could, in 2000 years, we could hide a bunch of it. But I think it is interesting to a lot of people, and I don't know if it's misunderstood. That'd be going too far, but I don't think it, it is well understood by a lot of people either.
No,
I think it's just focused on the big things. You know, you see the missionaries walking around. You know, the word of wisdom ish sort of stuff, even if they don't know it by name, and they know that there's this, you know, a crazy guy, Joseph Smith, and you know, they probably have watched South Park, so they know more true Mormon history than the average Mormon does about different things.
also a musical.
And there's the musical, and there's the musical too. And so but it has a fascinating side that is not in the public eye that I think this is bringing out. And it's not a good part of it. Like, I don't know if they're going to do anything more about the Mount Medet massacre, but if people look that up, I think they would be shocked. I think of the average Mormon who's never looked at it, looked into what the Mount Medet massacre was, they would be shocked
They
about.
should just read the Mormon Church's website about that. That would be a great start. Then they
Yeah,
could delve deeper if they wanted to. But yeah.
yeah. And I have a family history with that, don't you? We'll talk about that sometime.
Oh, I think you. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
you've told me about that.
It's not a good one, but it is one. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk more about it as more episodes come back. Thanks for hanging out
It's
with
only
us.
going to heat up.
All right. Bye.
Bye.